Plop plop, fizz fizz. It's poop.
Well, that's recorded.
Hi, I'm Shay.
I'm Cody.
And we are Sinister Explorations. Welcome back, and thanks so much for joining us for episode 3 of the Kirtland Blood Atonement Killings, Sescapades in the Wilderness.
Ooh, exciting.
I promised y'all we would get to the actual executions in this episode, and I am not going to let you down. Out of nothing else than desperation to wrap this up and get the Lundgrens out of my head, I'm going to do it. But to purge this horror show from my brain, it means this is going to be a long one.
Like I said, the Lundgrens are going to live there.
I don't want them in here anymore. So we're going to bypass pleasantries and get into this.
Let's do it.
All right. I do, however, have to start by alerting listeners that I will be sharing details regarding the execution of children, the details of which were difficult to write, so I imagine they're going to be difficult for you to hear. They're not explicitly graphic, though, so hang in there. If you don't want to hear these details, we do ask that you skip ahead a few minutes when we start discussing the actual murders themselves. It will be clear when we get to that point. I should also warn you that there will be some very lewd descriptions of sexual acts. I'm sure that is terribly surprising to you. They do not involve children in any way.
What about poop?
They involve so much poop.
I figured.
They only involve confused and consenting adults.
Okay, that's good.
All right. So we left off last episode on a bit of a cliffhanger. We made it to late 1988, and after the departure of Shar Olson and Kevin Curry, go Smarty Smarts, Jeff had 22 total cult members left, which consisted of 13 adults and 9 children.
Wow.
Yeah. Shar went to work at Chi-Chi's and had spilled the beans. Get it?
Oh, God.
About the cult's plans to Temple President Dale Luffman, who used the information to have Jeff excommunicated from the church. Kevin was back in Buffalo, hanging out with the Sabres, as you pointed out.
They have a hockey team.
They have a hockey team. And had reported Jeff's plans to the local Kirtland authorities, resulting in Chief Yarborough and Officer Andolsic keeping a watchful eye on the cult. Shar had also provided Yarborough and Andolsic with a myriad of helpful information. The entire police force, albeit a tiny one with 6 people, were stationed around the farm and the temple on May 3rd, the date of the temple takeover, but nothing happened, right? Jeff got skittish and pulled the plug on the plan.
Oh, but his birthday.
I know. It was so sad. Poor Jeff. He'd also announced to the cult that the new plan was to murder 10 people from within their own fold, and God gave a 6-month timer on that plan.
All right.
So began the process of determining whose blood was to be spilled. So I think that gets you caught up.
Yep.
Okay. So if you recall, the Patrick family, Dennis, Tanya, and their daughter Molly, were the ones to be killed during the planned temple takeover.
Right.
Okay. So it would seem they would be a natural choice, and they were certainly on Jeff's hit list. Jeff, feeling his list was sparse, though, he needed 10, added a few more names. Those were Richard Brand and Sharon Blunchley, which I was a bit surprised about because I thought Richard was his favorite.
Right.
It was because Richard had refused to follow his orders and marry Sharon.
Huh.
So he
So
said,
that deserves the death penalty.
oh, any disobeying of Jeff
Yeah.
is deserving of the death penalty. I almost said deserving. That is not a word. Sharon made the list because Alice found her to be irksome. Sharon couldn't make a decision for herself and was constantly asking for Alice's approval. This, coupled with Jeff's finding Sharon's inability to lose weight and therefore being physically repulsive, his words, not mine, to be reason enough to put her on a murder list.
Well, I would be dead.
You are.
passive.
Um,
So I've been told.
whatever. If we're being honest, they're all repulsive as humans in general.
100%.
Independent of their looks. But we did put a photo up on our Insta of Jeff.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to have a peek at that, I don't think he has a whole lot of room to shame a woman for being a bit thick.
Absolutely not.
Also on Jeff's hit list were the Avery family. If you remember the Averys, they were the boring family.
Yes.
Most people found to be a bit off-putting.
Did they slip on the rock?
Dennis slipped on the
Okay.
rock. Good memory.
Yeah.
They're the ones that they really didn't like, but they
Yes. Didn't really like him. But he sold his... he got an inheritance, and Jeff wanted him for the money. Yeah. Dennis had been confronting Jeff about his rent not being paid because Jeff put him up in a house, said, "I'll pay your rent, give me all your money," and then, of course, didn't pay the rent. And even worse, Dennis had questioned some of Jeff's teachings in class, and that was a disobedience absolutely worthy of death in Jeff's eyes. So the Averys weren't really around at the farmhouse much, though, since Jeff had put them up in that home about 15 miles away. And they didn't have a car anymore because they gave their car
away
to the Lundgrens. So, and nobody wanted to go pick them up. So they were blissfully unaware of this plan, I guess. The names of those on the hit list were never mentioned in class, but they were certainly brought up outside of class. So every member not on the hit list seemed to be well aware of the names that were on the list. So you can not say they didn't know. They knew. Jeff held classes nightly, which ran all night long, leaving members exhausted and delirious. That's a common cult leader practice, right? The content of the classes was exclusively about the executions and, of course, sex. Those are the only two things Jeff really thinks about.
Mm-hmm.
All preached while Jeff's .45 caliber pistol was positioned on the table beside him.
Wow. Did he just not trust them?
Sounds like
Dominance.
intimidation, maybe.
That makes sense.
Total intimidation play. Yep. And Jeff was dipping his toe into establishing carnal dominance over the group as well. He would come up behind Debbie and say he was going to run his tongue all over her body.
Yummy.
Debbie was his cousin.
Oh.
Yeah, it's his cousin.
Even more gross.
I know. Jeff also announced to the cult that after the executions, the group would be leaving the farm and moving into the wilderness, while the remaining seals were being opened by Jeff the Destroyer Lundgren. So he got his cool WWE name. And who else should take over the men's physical training in preparation for their wilderness trek than Jeff's 18-year-old son, Damon?
It makes sense.
His qualifications?
Son.
Same.
He was a high school wrestler. That's it. That's his whole resume. He was a high school wrestler. So I'm not disparaging wrestlers. I'm a huge MMA fan. Total badasses. But my memories of high school wrestlers were a bunch of underweight, kind of scrawny dudes running around wearing garbage bags, trying to cut weight and passing out in the lunchroom because they weren't allowed to eat or drink anything.
And I believe I posted a picture of Damon as well, and that pretty much fits the bill.
Yes.
Yeah.
While Damon was running a CrossFit camp, Jeff was spending his time building the cult's arsenal, which now included the addition of a .50 caliber rifle, because according to Jeff, they needed a gun capable of taking down a helicopter. Oddly, this is the one time Jeff may have had actual foresight. By late January, Jeff started to worry that the executions of 10 members would leave his flock a little light-handed for their life in the wilderness, so he reached out to his old college friend, Keith Johnson. Remember Keith?
I do remember Keith.
Okay. So Keith made a visit out to the farm on February 16th, and by March, the Johnson family, comprised of Keith, Catherine, and their 4 sons, moved to the farmhouse in Kirtland.
Keith.
Yeah. If you had any hope for him, hope's dashed. Sorry.
Yeah.
So with the addition of some able-bodied members to the cult and only a month away from God's timer going off, Jeff turned his attention to determining what method of murder would be used for the executions. This is a little gory. This is not how the executions go down. So I will tell you that. So I'm not going to go into, this will not be part of that. But at the time, the plan was for men, obviously beheading, since Nephi beheaded Laban with the sword of Laban. According to Jeff, women were to be stripped naked and sliced open in a way to allow their organs to spill out. I'm not 100% positive where in the Bible this comes from, but I know Hosea does talk about women being punished through nakedness and rape. So I think maybe this is something with a manipulation of those verses. And for children, they were to be swung by their feet and their heads bashed against a wall.
Damn.
Oh, God.
I also believe this is from a mixture of a passage in Hosea and one in Psalms. So the Bible's pretty dark and depraved with punishments, especially Old Testament
It
stuff.
can be a little violent.
I feel like if you're getting beheaded here, you're, best off out of everybody.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be the way I want to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which it does make sense that Jeff would give the men the easiest way out.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with the method of murders out of the way, what else was the crew up to? Well, they were preparing for life in the wilderness, of course. Jeff was doling out assignments. Sharon was learning forest foraging. All I could think of was
The
urban
Office?
foraging.
Oh.
No, urban foraging from the League. Andre's urban foraging.
Makes me think of when Michael Scott wants to go out and do
yeah.
versus Wild, and he cuts his pants off, puts it on his head, but then as he gets cold, so he tapes it back into his pants.
Toit has to knock the mushrooms out of his mouth.
Yeah.
I heard there are death cap mushrooms growing here. People are
Oh, really?
foraging them. I don't know anything about any of these mushrooms, but anyway. Don't eat mushrooms from the wild, people, unless you know exactly what they are. Damon was researching explosives and crafting homemade bombs. Danny was forging birth certificates in case cult members needed to alter their identities. Debbie and Greg were at the library researching unsolved crimes and how hot a fire needed to be to cremate a body. And Jeff was collecting over 4,000 rounds of ammunition.
Jeez.
Oh, and Alice was making a flag for him for his army of Israel, just like a little Betsy Ross.
Wow.
That's her name, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
Betsy Ross.
Would this be a time frame where they'd be researching this on a computer at the library, or would they be looking this up in a book, how to burn a body?
88, I would have been looking it up in books. Microfiche.
Yes, microfiche, not fish.
Microfiche. You never had to live through that, did you?
I don't know what you're
Microfiche?
talking about. Is that the thing where it's
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You used to have to put a slide thing in and
Are newspapers in those normally?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Everyone was also instructed to send letters, including made-up stories to relatives and employers to cover up their absences, because they're all just getting ready to head out. On April 10th, Keith and Ron were instructed to dig a pit in the barn large enough to hold 10 people because the date of the executions had been set, April 16th.
Oh, that's my birthday.
Whoa.
Uh-oh.
It doesn't happen on the 16th, I can
Okay.
tell you that. Jeff also told Keith and Ron that it just wasn't practical to behead, gut, and bash out the brains of 10 people, so he went searching scripture for an alternative method of execution, and he found one. He translated the scripture, "I will make thy horns iron, I will make thy hooves brass," to mean that he could shoot the 10 victims as bullets were made of iron slugs and a brass shell.
Well, that is a lot easier.
Much easier. That's exactly what I typed. Much easier. So with the cult's plans falling together nicely, let's check in on our buddies over in law enforcement and what they'd been doing in the last 6 months.
All 6 of them?
All 6 of them. Really just 2 of them. It's really just Yarborough and Dulcic, and then Yarborough's FBI friend, Alvord.
Yeah.
Were they getting a helicopter?
Not yet, but these tenacious dudes were not giving up. So Yarborough had been working with FBI agent Alvord on ways in which the FBI could get involved. Since Planned Temple takeover had failed, though, the FBI wasn't really convinced there was a crime, so they still felt it was a local matter, but he was kind of like consulting for them. Yarborough and Alvord were able to convince the FBI field office that Jeff was a potential domestic terrorist, having violated domestic security statutes and allegedly violated the civil rights of his followers. So pretty smart. I cannot continue to say Yarborough and Dulcic and Alvord, so collectively I am calling them Team Wet Wipe, since that's how you clean up poop.
Oh, that's so smart of you to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
They thought they had enough to secure a search warrant, but it was unfortunately denied due to insufficient evidence. So instead, Team Wet Wipe decided to make a risky move. They, along with 6 Kirtland officers plus 16 FBI officers, were going to confront Jeff at the farm without a search warrant. Their hope was that he wouldn't know that they needed one, and maybe they would be able to go and talk to people and look through the farmhouse.
As bad as I said this, Jeff is a smart guy. I don't see this going quite to plan.
Yes and no. Yep. So they prepped the officers and set the date of April 18th. 2 days. 2 days after Jeff's plan to execute a family. It would end up being only 1 day late because Dennis, on April 16th, called Jeff and said, "Oh, hey, I happen to be able to get approved for a credit card with a $1,500 limit. I thought you might want to use that for wilderness supplies." So Jeff, wanting to use all of the money he could, said, "Oh, yeah, buddy, let's go shopping tomorrow." So he had to postpone killing him for a day.
Well, you got to spend the $1,500.
Exactly.
Take advantage.
I don't know what that gets you, but I mean,
Well,
in 1988, maybe a lot
Yeah,
more.
that would probably be quite a bit.
Yeah. Then at Bass Pro Shops, I think that would go a bit of a way.
So what do you recommend if you're planning to go out to the woods and, I don't know, maybe execute a few people? You got anything for that?
I'm sure they would help you. No offense, Bass Pro Shops, sorry.
We're not getting a sponsorship from them.
That's okay.
The delay of a day also allowed God to send word to Jeff that the good work being done by Sharon Blunchley, now Brand, since Jeff did force Richard to marry her, and Tanya Patrick was enough to ransom their husbands and families from execution.
Yay!
So now the only people that needed to be killed were the Averys.
Poor Avery's.
On the morning of April 17th, Greg Winship made reservations at the Red Roof Inn for the Avery family. Jeff's amazing plan here was that the Averys would go to the Red Roof Inn with all of their personal effects, clothing and stuff, because all their other stuff was already in the barn. And then the cult could go after they were executed and remove all of their stuff and make it look like they had just left all of a sudden. So we go from, does he know they need a search warrant, to,
Right.
that's a good plan. I don't know. And with the $1,500, Jeff also told Greg to buy a stun gun, as it would help to subdue the victims. On the evening of April 17th, most cult members were invited for a group dinner. The Avery family was picked up by Richard, and they arrived at the farmhouse just after 6 p.m. 7-year-old Karen Avery, wearing her rainbow and pony sweatshirt, ran to Alice to give her a hug and apologize for forgetting to bring along a drawing she'd made for her. Absent from the dinner were the Patricks and the Johnson families, because Jeff didn't think Dennis and Keith were going to be able to go through with the plan.
Are they not suspicious, like, at all?
Who?
Avery.
Not at all. Not at all.
They're blinded by
Yeah.
all this.
Completely think this is a dinner before they're moving into the wilderness.
They don't realize it's their last supper.
Exactly.
Dang. See what you did there.
As soon as dinner was over, Alice left with the 3 younger Lundgren children. She would drop them off at the Patrick's house and go to the store for wilderness supplies. Jeff went into his bedroom to collect his .45 pistol and proceeded to ask Ron, Greg, Richard, Danny, and Damon if they were in or if they were out, and each man confirmed they were in. If you want to skip ahead to not hear about the murders, now would be the time. With that, all men got into position, Jeff, Danny, and Damon inside the barn, ready to restrain the victims, Greg outside the barn, running a chainsaw to mask the sound of gunshots, and Ron is the go-between from the barn to the house to bring the Avery family members to their deaths one by one. Ron entered the farmhouse and told Dennis Avery that Jeff needed him in the barn so they could select what items the Averys would be taking with them into the wilderness. As soon as Dennis entered the barn, Ron used a stun gun, but it did little than to cause extreme pain and result in Dennis asking what was going on. Reacting quickly, Richard, Danny, Greg, and Damon knocked Dennis to the ground, taped his hands and feet together, and put duct tape over his mouth. Richard then carried Dennis to the back of the barn, where they let his body slide down into the 4-foot deep pit. Dennis looked up to see Jeff standing over him. Jeff was insistent that Dennis's eyes not be taped over, as he wanted Dennis to look at who was sending him before God for his wickedness. Jeff raised his gun and fired 2 rounds directly into Dennis's heart. His lifeless, blood-soaked body slumped into the mud. Jeff then remembered he'd forgotten to get the Red Roof Inn key out of Dennis's pocket, so he instructed Damon to jump in the pit and get it. And while no one else was outwardly reacting at all, Damon was in tears and nearly paralyzed by what had just happened. He was 18.
Right.
Unable to move, Ron jumped into the pit to retrieve the key from Dennis's corpse. However, the key wasn't on him. It was in Cheryl's purse. Ron returned to the house to collect Cheryl and the key, telling her Dennis needed her in the barn. As soon as she crossed the threshold, she was swarmed by Greg, Danny, and Richard. Ron told her not to struggle and to just give it up. They taped her hands, feet, and mouth, same as Dennis, but with Cheryl, they also taped over her eyes. Richard and Ron carried Cheryl to the pit and dropped her in. Jeff fired several shots into Cheryl, hitting her in the stomach and chest. Unlike Dennis, who was shot with hollow point rounds, Cheryl was shot with full metal jacket rounds. The reason for this was nothing more than Jeff's experimentation. Jeff would later say, according to the scripture, I was going to kill again. I wanted to learn as much as I could from this experience. Sadly, the switch in bullets meant Cheryl didn't die instantly. The coroner estimated that she probably spent 5 minutes in the pit before dying. With the stun gun not working as hoped, the men in the barn devised a plan to make it easier for them to subdue and tape up the Avery children. Like it was going to be hard to subdue children. They were going to tell them they were playing a game of hear no evil, see no evil, which was a game they played, I guess, all of the time, where they would
So this
wrap their face.
Common.
So that would explain the duct tape being placed over their faces. Ron returned to the house to collect 15-year-old Trina, telling her mother was asking for her. Telling her mother was asking for her. The men in the barn played a word game with Trina, who stood patiently while tape was placed around her ankles, wrists, and hands, trusting that her elders of the church were doing what was right for her. She was placed in the pit, sitting against a wall. The first bullet fired only grazed the side of her head, but the second bullet entered the crown, exiting below her right ear. Just for good measure, Jeff shot her 2 more times in the back. Fortunately for Trina, her death was instantaneous, even though it was only a result of Jeff's further experimentation to see if a headshot or a heart shot would result in a faster death. Ron immediately returned to the house for 13-year-old Becky, who was excited to go to the barn as Ron promised her time to visit with the horses. Becky's treatment upon entering the barn was the same as Trina's. However, when Becky saw the tape being put over her eyes, she seemed anxious and asked what was going on. She was taped and carried to the pit. The first shot fired entered Becky's thigh, which only caused extreme pain. Becky slumped forward, falling against her mother's body. The second shot was fired into her back, at which time her hands, still duct taped together at the wrist, reached out as if to touch her mother's body. Becky was still alive. They could see she was breathing, although through gurgled sounds, as blood was filling her lungs. Jeff did not fire another shot, though, and left Becky to eventually die from blood loss or suffocation because he wanted to see how long it took. Ron returned to the house for 7-year-old Karen, who, when asked if she was ready to go see the horsies, replied, "Oh, way," as she had a slight speech impediment. Ron gave her a piggyback ride to the barn, just like he did with his son, who was the same age as Karen. Karen put up no resistance to being taped up, although she seemed scared when the tape was put around her eyes and mouth. Karen's tiny body was dropped into the pit beside the corpses of her entire family. Jeff, having already tried multiple bullets and entry points, decided with Karen to fire a hollow point straight down into her skull from less than 2 feet away. The second shot entered the exact same hole. You're done with the murders.
That's rough.
Yeah. With the entire Avery family dead, Jeff instructed the men to dump bags of lime over the bodies, cover them with rocks, and then fill the pit with dirt before placing trash over the area. At this point, Alice had returned home. Jeff, Alice, and Damon headed to the Red Roof Inn to pack up all of the Avery's possessions. During a final scan of the hotel room to ensure they gathered everything, Alice saw the drawing Karen had made for her sitting on the counter, a rainbow with the words to Alice, "I love you, Karen." Alice gasped before placing the drawing in the trash bag. It was around midnight when they made it back home. The Patricks and Johnsons had now arrived for scripture class, and everyone gathered in the living room. Seemingly everyone was in tears, with the exception of Jeff. Jeff praised a majority of the group for their efforts, but chastised Richard and Dennis Patrick heavily, informing them that they were only spared due to the dedication of their wives, and reminded them that they could still end up like the Averys at any time. Jeffrey tried to console everyone, reminding them that Dennis Avery was under the power of Satan. He even used Dennis's last words in the barn, which literally were, "This isn't necessary," uttered while he was being stun-gunned and taped up to show that Dennis was rebellious and attempting to take over Jeff's role. Alice continued her role as Jeff's cheerleader, telling everyone they should praise and be thankful to Jeff for what he had done so they could go to meet God. Jeff instructed the women to comfort their husbands and reminded the group that this was just the beginning and they would have to kill many more in their work toward opening the remaining seals, and dismiss the class. I'm going to take a sip and pause for a moment because that's heavy. Okay. The next day, the FBI and local police force arrived at the farmhouse at 10 a.m., one day too late. They were aware that the cult had a stockpile of weapons in the house and could open fire at any time. On the top of their interview list were Jeff, Alice, Greg, Richard, Ron, Danny, Sharon, and Debbie. Alice answered the knock at the door to see Team Wet Wipe standing there and asking to speak to Jeff. Alice called to Jeff, who joined Team Wet Wipe in the house. With Jeff in sight and the remaining agents swarmed the property. Alice was put in a car where Andolsic told her that she and Jeff were under suspicion for a crime that could end up with both of them receiving the death penalty, before peppering her with questions. It only took a few questions for both Jeff and Alice to realize that Andolsic knew nothing about the execution of the Avery family, and his questions were all in relation to Planned Temple takeover. Jeff also realized that they lacked a search warrant. He was smart enough. But in an effort to get them out of the house as fast as possible, he did willingly show them a bag of pistols. They asked to see the rifle hidden behind the false wall in the bedroom, which assured Jeff that Shar was the informant.
Oh.
Jeff showed them the rifle, which hadn't been altered to fire automatically, so he knew there wasn't any action they could take against him. That was completely legal. And at this point, many of the cult members had started to gather outside of the farmhouse. Realizing law enforcement had no clue about the events the night before, they were fairly lighthearted. They answered questions about Jeff being a prophet and having visions with sarcasm and amusement, really, making the questions seem silly. At 11:51, Team Wet Wipe had no option but to head out, finding nothing incriminating enough to take action. There was one cult member who flubbed up significantly, though.
Who was it?
Dumbass Keith Johnson, who was shaking in his boots the second law enforcement arrived. While everybody else is being sarcastic and being like, oh yeah, Jeff's a prophet and we've seen him do so many miracles, Keith Johnson gave an account similar to what they had heard from Shar and Kevin Curry. He talked about earthquakes, the destruction of civilization, the sword of Laban, and that God was going to appear to the group.
All right.
Was there any mention of Highlander?
Probably. So while the FBI or the law enforcement couldn't take any action against anything from Keith's story, it was enough for them to want to continue their investigation, thankfully. They left with nothing. The events of the morning caused Jeff to come apart at the seams, though. He told the cult to burn all of their class notes and talk in a whisper since the house had probably been bugged. He was so shook that Alice and Greg had to take control, ensuring the group that the law knew nothing about their actions the night before and that they should move quickly to begin their wilderness trek. The group would begin their journey that night, making it to Davis, West Virginia, to stay in a hotel named none other than the Highlander.
You're kidding, right?
I am not kidding. And I looked it up. It is a real...
Is it still there?
Recently closed. I think it closed in 2020.
What are the odds?
Mm-hmm. That's what they thought. So they were like, oh, well,
It's
yeah.
a sign.
Yeah.
It's a sign. Jeff got it back together by this point mentally. If Jeff ever had it together mentally, I'm not sure. And would use the prior day raids by law enforcement to convince the group that he was a true seer and that God's protection was with the cult. Found the Highlander Hotel,
I was
guys.
going to say, I mean, the Highlander says it all.
Yeah. It would take Jeff 3 days to find a free camping area for the cult, which was located off an access road for the power company in Davis, West Virginia.
I just love that it's free. He's such a
It had to
cheap
be
ass.
free. He is so cheap.
Like, yeah, we just killed a whole family. We're on the run from the law, but I'm not putting any money down for a campsite.
No. Team Wet Wipe hadn't pulled back on their investigating, though, and had tracked the cult's rental truck to West Virginia and alerted local authorities. Within weeks, the cult's campsite was discovered by local sheriff Hank Thompson. Now that they had committed the executions required by God, Jesus must be about ready to appear, right?
Yeah.
You think? So Jeff went to pray on that. He did receive revelation, too. Because when doesn't he?
Did.
Unfortunately, they still hadn't done enough in the eyes of God for him to reveal himself, so more purification would be needed. But Jeff was the guy to get them pure, as God had told him that Jeff was now, quote, God of the whole earth, and the only law was his law. Oh, and he was immortal.
Wow.
It's a great LinkedIn profile. God of the earth, immortal.
God of the whole earth.
God of the whole earth.
I don't know. I think I like the destroyer better than God of the whole earth.
The Destroyer sounds a little more fierce.
It had been a whole 2 weeks since the executions, but the cult members were being super emo. Cody's having a fit. You're allowed to cough.
I'm trying not to cough, but I have a tickle in my throat.
So it had been a whole 2 weeks since the executions, but the cult members were being super emo and all sad about killing an entire family, and Jeff had had enough.
How dare they?
I know. I mean, how much does this guy have to do for a group of people and they're still going to be bummed out? God. So God of the whole earth banned them from uttering the Averys' names ever again. Dennis Patrick had fallen into a deep depression, so Jeff continuously reminded him that what happened to the Averys could happen to him at any time. Dennis was actually afraid for his life.
As he should be.
Constantly. As they all should be.
Right.
Yeah.
What really drove this, though, his hatred of Dennis, was as much as Jeff wanted to take a second wife, he had his eyes on Tanya, Dennis's wife.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
How does he swing this one?
Oh, he does. It didn't take long for Jeff to have Tanya and Molly move into his and Alice's tent and prohibit conversations between them and Dennis. I mean, he's the prophet, Jeremy.
Yeah, what are you going to say to the prophet
Exactly.
and God of the whole earth?
3 days later, Jeff would inform Tanya that he was in love with her, and using that good old chiastic principle, told her that there were 2 sides to the rib cage. So there wasn't just one woman for every man, 2.
I was just figuratively thinking about my rib cage.
Oh, okay.
Besides,
Thought you were wondering if you could get another wife.
no,
Okay.
one's enough.
Within a week, Tanya and Jeff were having an affair behind the back of Alice, but it didn't take long for Alice to suss it out. Within a couple of months, Jeff informed Alice God was tired of her rebellion and instructed him to pierce Tanya, which he could do with his dick or a bullet. Alice got to choose. Those are my words, not Jeff's, but...
Which one did she choose?
Yeah.
Well, take a guess. These are terrible people, so what do you think?
Boy, those sound horrible, but bullet.
I'm thinking dick.
Dick.
Yeah.
Alice didn't want anybody else to die, I guess, now all of a sudden.
She's grown a conscience.
Yeah, no. Making that decision wasn't the only punishment for her, though. Jeff took her out to the woods, instructed her to get naked. He took a big poop, instructed her to smear it all over him, and tell him how beautiful he was while he masturbated. He then put some poop in his mouth, kissed Alice, and made her give him a blowy. Told you we'd get back to the fecalphilia of it all.
Well, now they're on a wilderness retreat, so she can't even get in the bathtub.
Yeah, there's no bathtub.
Yeah.
Hopefully there's a creek nearby.
So he put his own poop in his mouth.
Yep.
And then kissed her.
Yep.
And then she blew him.
Yep. But that's pretty much it. Yep. Nailed it.
I'm just processing now.
I thought Blumpkins were bad, but that takes it to a whole new level.
The Blumpkin King.
Well,
By month 4 in the wilderness, everyone was depressed.
Well, no shit.
Even without the shit, they were depressed. Jesus still wouldn't appear, and the cult didn't know how to shed their sin, or even what their sins were, really. So ever helpful, Jeff went to ask God about it. God had 2 messages for Jeff this day. One was the women in the camp were being too prideful, and the second was a vision of a perfect vagina, and God wanted Jeff to find that vagina.
of course.
Sounds like a weird Japanese cave show. Find that vagina! The remedy for the pridefulness was for the women to humble themselves in front of Jeff by performing a striptease for him. A 1-hour-long striptease to the music of Jeff's choice.
Highlight your soundtrack.
With Alice present to provide any support needed by Jeff. I cannot make this up. Let me please tell you that one of the music tracks selected was Beverly Hills Cop. That meant the Neutron Dance was playing at some point during this.
I feel like the movie might be ruined for me now. And I'm a big fan of Beverly Hills Cop. I just watched the entire trilogy earlier this year.
We did.
You'll be thinking about other stuff now. If you're watching it.
It was really just Beverly Hills Cop, the search for the perfect vagina.
Oh, Axel Foley.
It's not his fault. During their dances, Jeff would masturbate into their underwear since his semen was analogous to Jesus' blood being shed for the redemption of sin. Each woman would then have to wear those underwear for a day, return to her husband, and read a statement, and then the husbands would have to go to Jeff and swear loyalty to him.
And the husbands were aware of all this, right?
Not that the dances were happening. That was kept secret from them.
Did they know about the cum pants?
Not beforehand. Afterhand, I guess. After cum, they did. After, yeah.
Came?
Yeah. These dances were conducted over a couple of days. I guess Jeff wasn't virile enough to come over and over again in succession. And his rule was that if he didn't ejaculate, then the woman's sins were not purified, and her entire family would have to be killed.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. The great discovery from all of this was that Katherine Johnson had the vagina Jeff was looking for.
Oh, thank God.
Keith's wife, Katherine.
Now I want to know.
You want to know what?
About the vagina?
What? Yeah. I want to know why her.
Was it a symmetry thing?
It was the same vagina that God had shown to him in a vision.
Huh.
The bad news was that Dennis Patrick had to be the next one to die since there wasn't anyone to dance on his behalf. Because he'd already been sleeping with Tanya and he didn't need to see her vagina again. But wait, Jeff would allow Katherine to atone for Dennis's sins, but a dance wasn't going to be enough. For these sins, Katherine was going to have to let Jeff pierce her magical vagina with his penis sword.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like, it could be worse for her if that's all that happens to her from Jeff during this.
I mean, at this point, what do you have to lose? Anyway.
So it's no longer the sword of Laban. It's
Sort of the god of the earth, the whole earth. Katherine had no qualms about doing this on behalf of Dennis, but she did have some massive fears about how Alice would react.
yeah.
It was super poorly, if you're wondering. Alice reacted super poorly. After the piercing, he would tell Katherine that she ruined him and he only wanted to have sex with her. Katherine, being just another idiot who couldn't see through a window, fell in love with Jeff. Katherine would end up being Jeff's third wife.
Remember, there's pictures of this guy. I don't understand.
There's pictures of Katherine, too.
Well, that's true, too.
Since he was only allowed to have 2 wives, though, because he only has 2 sides to his rib cage, he said Tanya was a whoopsie-daisy and sent her back to Dennis Patrick. I didn't think a prophet could make a mistake like
Your
that.
vagina was nice. It was great, but it's just not the perfect one from God.
Not the one.
Yeah.
And since he couldn't take any more wives, Jeff started working on convincing Greg that they were destined to become lovers, just like David and Jonathan were lovers in the Bible. This did freak out Greg a little bit, but Richard, Greg's best friend, was even more freaked out because at the barn, he had found a poop cut caked dildo alongside some gay porn magazines in the bed of a truck. So he was pretty worried for his friend Greg.
Yeah.
During this time of sexcapades in the wilderness, that's why I named it this, the FBI was in contact with Sheriff Spencer in West Virginia, who up until this time had been keeping the fact that an armed religious cult was living in the woods under wraps, since he figured if that got leaked out, local good old boys would just go out there and shoot them all. Spencer didn't want to infiltrate guns blazing, though, as he knew there were a lot of kids living with the cult, so he made the decision to fly a helicopter over the camp to see what the cult was up to and how they would react. Jeff's reaction to the helicopter was to immediately send Alice and their children, along with Susie Luff and their children, to stay with Alice's parents. I thought his initial reaction would be to drag out his .50 caliber and shoot down helicopters, since that's what he bought it for, but it was not. Jeff might have been legitimately concerned about Alice and the children's safety. I have a hard time thinking that, though, because this guy's a piece of shit.
Yeah,
I wonder if it
would be surprising.
Yeah, I wonder if it was more like maybe the kids will give them away easier, because they're loud, or they might get scared.
It's all conjecture, of course. I'm thinking it was so he could be with Catherine. I guess. He also announced he was splitting up the camp. He and Catherine, along with Greg, Ron, Debbie, and Damon, would be moving deeper into the forest, while the others would stay at the current site. And probably, in Jeff's mind, killed by law enforcement, since they were in the same place.
A sacrifice.
Again, speculation. Don't know. But I think he was tired of being nagged about when Jesus was going to appear and having to figure out what to do to feed this group of people. 3 days later, Sheriff Spencer landed a helicopter by the first campsite and was approached by Danny Kraft and Dennis Patrick. Spencer was there to check things out, but he used the excuse that he was there to ensure the children were enrolled in school. After leaving, Spencer phoned Yarborough to inform him that he didn't see Jeff at the camp. The visit resulted in Jeff knowing that the cult needed to be on the move, but this was difficult since the relationships among the members were dissolving. Excuse me.
Well, yeah, he keeps having sex with everyone's wives.
Yeah.
And some of their husbands, it sounds like.
Yeah. Wanting to. He didn't. Richard, who begrudgingly married Sharon under Jeff's orders, had stopped talking to her. Greg and Debbie, also married under Jeff's orders, were having problems. Ron was missing his wife Susie, who was with Alice at her parents' house. Keith was depressed, always. Keith's always depressed, but rightfully so. Jeff stole his wife. And Dennis wanted nothing to do with Tanya after he learned about the affair with Jeff. Plus, it was turning bitterly cold, and the cult didn't have any money. So, falling apart at the seams here. Throughout the cult's duration, Jeff had mentally abused the group and caused conflict among members. So what had changed? Well, Alice wasn't there. The cheerleader of Jeff, to make sure that they were all on board, was gone. And despite how poorly he treated Alice, Jeff wasn't good without her, and I'm pretty sure he knew this. So Jeff and Ron headed to Max Creek to retrieve Alice and convince her polygamy was all good.
It's all good.
All good.
All good.
This time, the interaction between Jeff and Alice went off script from their norm, though. During a private conversation between Alice and Jeff about polygamy, Alice slapped Jeff. This time, Jeff didn't acquiesce to the violence like he often did. Instead, he lashed out, smacking her back, punching her in the stomach, causing her to fall to the ground. He then hit her in the face, rupturing her eardrum.
Jeez.
Yeah. And this time, Alice didn't just blush over Jeff coming to get her and forget about everything he'd done and run off. This time, she didn't leave with him. He continued to call her, but she wasn't having it and told him if he didn't go back to the camp right away, she was going to turn him into the police. So Jeff returned to camp, but he wasn't done trying to get Alice back. There was no money for his travels back to her, though, or to keep the camp going. So he sold some of his guns, including the one he used to execute the Averys, to a pawn shop, making enough money to make the trip back to Max Creek again. He left Catherine behind, furious that Jeff hadn't yet told Alice that they were married, that she was pregnant, and that he was leaving his flock with nothing. Alice refused again. Don't be too hopeful.
Oh, I'm not. I just can't believe it took her this long. And still, I'm sure she...
Yeah. Desperate to find somewhere for the cult to go, Catherine called friends seeking help. eventually finding one who allowed her and the cult members to stay in an abandoned dairy barn in Chilhowie, Missouri. I'm pretty sure I got that right.
She spent a lot of time looking it up. I could hear her in the other room.
I listened to it one time, and then I didn't write down the pronunciation. I'm pretty sure it's Chilhowie.
Even if you didn't, it's still fun. So
It was fun.
well, yeah.
We'll get letters. Loving drama, Jeff took Catherine with him on his third trip to retrieve Alice. Big surprise, that did not go well. Alice and Catherine actually ended up getting in a full-on fistfight at the grocery store. Alice had taken to drinking heavily again, and despite having several physical altercations with Jeff, she just couldn't quit him. She'd fight, apologize, say she couldn't live without him, and as soon as she said she would return to the camp, Jeff let her know that as a rebellious wife, she had to be punished and purified first. He sent her to the bathroom, and I think we all know what happened, so I do not need to go through the story again, right?
She got a bath. She had a nice, relaxing night. Glass of
Nice
wine.
bubble bath, candles. Yeah.
Yeah.
He put some roses down.
Yeah. When the poop-isode was over, Jeff cleaned her up, told her she was purified, she thanked him, and they headed back. But once at the camp, Alice was put in a private tent next to Jeff and Catherine's tent.
Oh, she didn't even get back in the tent.
Alice claimed she was able to see them having sex that night, and in the morning she told Jeff she was going back to her parents, and she actually left on her own accord. It was with Alice's final departure and Jeff's continual self-serving twisting of scripture that led to the cult's disintegration. Finally. I like how when the members were interviewed after capture, they were like, and Alice leaving was all we could take. Not the murder of a family.
Right.
Not months in the wilderness. No. Alice leaving, that was it. We were done. She did not come back.
I can't congratulate her.
No. Greg and Richard were the first to make an attempt at escaping. Greg no longer believed Jeff was a prophet, and while Richard wasn't sure, he felt that Jeff may be looking to kill him or have him kill Greg. Early November, each of them packed a suitcase and put them outside a car, planning to sneak away. But fucking Debbie saw the suitcases and alerted Jeff. Despite Jeff's threats to kill them, they were able to leave, and they were never to return to the cult again. Sorry. By mid-November, Sheriff Thompson phoned Yarborough to let him know the cult was no longer in the woods of West Virginia, and that all that was left behind was a tent, a sewing machine, and a Bible with Keith Johnson's name written in it. Yarborough made some calls and was able to learn that the cult was living in a dairy barn in Missouri. He also discovered that Jeff had taken Catherine as a wife and Alice had moved back to her parents. His initial thought was that the group was falling apart, so he probably didn't need to pursue anything much anymore, but he just couldn't shake the feeling he had, because he's a good detective. His thoughts instantly turned to wondering if something had happened to Keith Johnson, causing his Bible to be left behind. He contacted Kevin Curry in Buffalo and shared the names of those who went with Jeff into the wilderness. When he said the Averys, Kevin claimed doubt, saying he didn't think Jeff would ever suffer the Averys on a wilderness trek. Yarborough checked his notes from the day of the FBI fake raid and found there were no interviews with the Averys either. This left him with a lot of questions and a lot more concern. The winter had turned bitterly cold and the cult was struggling, so they moved to a better barn on Ron's brother's property. Jeff had seemed to lose interest in the group and wasn't around much, as he, Catherine, and his children had moved into a trailer on the property. The group grew more disenfranchised and looked to Ron for guidance. Ron didn't have to do much planning, though, as his brother quickly learned that Jeff had multiple wives and kicked them all off his property. Yeah. Without their profit, money, and a place to stay, they had no choice but to break up the band.
Oh, no.
Yeah. Ron and Susie remained at the house with Ron's brother. Jeff, Damon, and Danny headed to Max Creek to reunite with Alice. Catherine went to stay with a friend, and Keith went to his father's. Sharon and pregnant Debbie went to stay with Debbie's friend, and the Patricks went to Tanya's parents' house. So they've just
Scattered.
Once away from the group and from Jeff, the members' mental clarity seemed to return.
Oh.
Yeah. The only ones who remained faithful to Jeff were Danny Kraft and Catherine. The distance from Jeff also allowed Keith Johnson, Catherine's rightful husband, to grow a pair. He phoned Jeff and threatened to turn him into the police unless he ended his relationship with Catherine. After having some smarts, Keith had provided a letter detailing the executions to his attorney in a sealed envelope with instructions to read it should anything happen to him. So he might be an emo guy, but he's a little bit smart.
At least he looks ahead.
A little bit. Jeff wasn't ready to give up Catherine, though, who was pregnant with his child.
Well, I mean, that vagina.
The vagina. So he picked her up and put her up in a hotel in Odessa, Missouri. He was terrified that Keith Johnson was coming for him. Funny how the tables turned there. And decided they needed to make a move to California, where all good cultists end up anyway. Jeff, Alice, Danny, and the children immediately, and eventually Catherine, once Jeff could convince Alice to allow it. So they all moved, and then he was going to convince Alice that Catherine and he were married and polygamy was cool. At the same time period, the scattered cult members had reconnected and were meeting at the home where Debbie and Sharon were staying. The group talked about turning Jeff into the police, but had legitimate concerns about their own implications in the murders. Now, all of a sudden, they seemed to have a conscience and worried Jeff would form another cult and execute another family, so they felt like they had to do something.
At least they finally have some concern.
Ultimately, everyone in the group agreed that no one would go to the police until everyone was ready. Well, everybody except Keith Johnson, who said nothing. Remember, while Keith had helped dig the pit, Keith had not been invited to the farm the night of the Avery's murder, as Jeff felt he wouldn't be able to go through with it. So Jeff's assessment of Keith as being a bit soft may have been spot on, as it was Keith who on New Year's Eve in 1989 phoned the FBI and informed Agent Richard Van Helst that a family of 5 were murdered and buried in a barn on the outskirts of Kirtland. Van Helst immediately called Yarborough. At 10:30 p.m. on January 2nd, Yarborough and Indulsic met outside the barn behind the farmhouse. They made their way into an area packed with so much debris that they knew they would have to wait until daylight to get the help they needed to clear the area. The next day, Alvord, the FBI friend, arrived on site, bringing Team Wet Wipe together again. Fate's a funny thing, and that same day, not knowing Keith had already reported the murders to the authorities, Dennis and Tanya Patrick and Debbie Oliveras entered the police station to inform them that they were no longer in Jeff's group. We just wanted you to know.
It's convenient.
What's that supposed to do at this point? For them?
Take heat off of them? I'm not sure.
Well, I feel like that just puts
that
more
was
heat on them.
When Yarborough and Alvord's questions focused on the Averys, panic set in. Because remember, they don't think anybody in law enforcement knows about the Averys. Right. They were just saying like, hey, we're not there anymore and you don't have to watch us because Planned Temple Takeover didn't happen and we're out, we're cool.
Yeah, we're innocent.
Yeah. Team Wet Wipe was on site at 9 a.m. and junk removal of the barn began immediately. It wasn't until 4 p.m. that enough space was opened up to allow Indulsic to crawl in. It didn't take him long to find the ground with evidence of digging. By 8 p.m., the barn was fully illuminated by floodlights and cleared of trash. Firemen began digging, and with the first shovel of dirt being turned, the stench of death permeated the barn. By 9 p.m., they had uncovered the body of Dennis Avery. Additional law enforcement was called in, including the FBI, who now all of a sudden is like, oh yeah, we should get involved in this. As the tiny and virtually crimeless town of Kirtland had never had to process a crime scene like this, and they needed help. There's very little crime in Kirtland. The second body was uncovered with Cheryl, whose head was completely wrapped in duct tape. The girls' bodies were uncovered. Karen, being the last to be killed, needed to be removed first, as she was partially covering the bodies of her sisters. This is a little rough if you want to fast forward 20 seconds. Water had been entering the pit from a broken pipe, and rain coming in, creating suction around Karen's body, and when they lifted her, her foot fell off.
Ugh.
This emotionally destroyed everyone. They carry this with them, some still, and those that have passed up until their death. They had nightmares about this. For the removal of the rest of the bodies, they were wrapped in sheets to keep them intact. However, when they were wrapping Trina in a sheet, her braided hair and scalp came off in the hands of one agent. Danny Kraft would be the first to see the news story, quickly alerting Jeff and Alice, who would make it to the TV in time to see the bodies of the Avery family being carried from the barn. Alice pleaded with Jeff to kill her and the children, but Jeff didn't seem up to killing another family for some reason. Well, not then, anyway. He did say he would go ask God about it.
I'll get back to you.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. For the time being, Jeff phoned Alice's mother and told her to come get the kids, and did so by telling her to just start driving west and call at 9 p.m. for more directions. This idiot wanted a lady to start driving from Missouri west and hoped she would eventually get to San Diego. If you are like me, which you probably aren't, but if you are geographically inept. Don't give me that look. I looked at Google Maps. If you were to just head west from Overland Park, Missouri, you would end up quite a bit north of Sacramento. So right state, but 9 hours too north.
Yeah.
She really needed to drive southwest, but it doesn't matter since she had already contacted federal law enforcement to inform them of a call from Jeff. She gave the ATF agents the phone number Jeff gave her to call when she was 9 p.m. the next night or whatever, and they were able to trace them so they could at least get her going in the right direction, which was southwest, like I said. At 9 p.m., Donna and the agents stopped in Oklahoma City and phoned as instructed by Jeff. ATF and agents had already staked out the payphone and followed Damon back to the hotel where Jeff kept his word to Alice and was asking God if he could kill her and the kids. Apparently, God's answer was that Alice could die, but she would have to do it herself, and only after the kids were gone.
That's convenient.
Yeah. Guess Jeff was hoping to avoid getting his hands more bloodied while still dumping the dead weight of Alice so he could pick up Catherine, who he had in another hotel, because he still hadn't fessed up to Alice about her. Donna continued her drive, and at 10 a.m. the morning of January 7th, 1990, phoned Damon again, this time from Holbrook, Arizona. Watching Damon from nearby was Van Helst, the FBI agent who took the call from Keith, giving up Jeff for the murders. He'd flown out to California to personally oversee the capture of the Lundgrens. He watched Damon head back to the hotel room, walking right past an agent disguised as a jogger. And then, like a perfectly scripted movie scene, it all played out. The undercover agent called Van Helst from a payphone to tell him Damon went into room 29. At the same time, Jeff entered the phone booth next to the agent to call Catherine. The agent confirmed Jeff was unarmed, so Van Helst decided to take a shot, ordering agents to move in. Agents pulled Jeff from the phone booth, where he was greeted by the barrel of Van Helst's revolver as his face met the sidewalk. Other agents busted into room 29 of the Santa Fe Motel and apprehended Damon and Alice and recovered numerous guns, including the AR-15. While handcuffs were being placed on Damon, he was already telling officers, "I didn't do the actual shooting."
It didn't take long.
Jeff and Damon remained steadfast in their refusal to talk after Damon had already said, I didn't do the shooting. But by 6:50 that night, Alice agreed to make a statement about the murders, putting all of the blame on Jeff, while also saying, you would have had to be stupid not to know what was going on. And that is where she knew Jeff was a prophet, and that she knew Jeff wasn't a prophet before they even moved to the farm. So why then didn't Alice make any attempt to stop Jeffrey? She claimed she was afraid for her own life and the lives of her children. On January 8th, Alice, Jeff, and Damon appeared for arraignment and were held without bail with a hearing scheduled for February 8th. Now attention's turned to finding Catherine and Danny. Their photos appeared all over the TV and newspapers, and an APB was put out across neighboring states. On January 10th, they were spotted traveling on State Route 78 and arrested. So what about the rest of the cult? Well, a case was presented against all members of the group, and the grand jurors indicted Jeff, Danny, Richard, Ron, and Damon, each for 5 counts of aggravated murder and 5 counts each for kidnapping. Alice, Debbie, Sharon, Greg, and Susan were each charged with 5 counts of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder and 5 counts of kidnapping. Dennis, Tanya, and Catherine were charged with 5 counts to commit aggravated murder. In Ohio, aggravated murder equates to deliberate, premeditated murder, but doesn't automatically carry the death penalty. However, if also convicted with applicable aggravating circumstances, the death penalty is the sentence. So for Jeff, Damon, Danny, Richard, and Ron, if sentenced, they would receive the death penalty. So when you think back to the roles that each of these men played on the evening of the execution, so Jeff was a trigger man. Ron, who like Karen on the river Styx, carried all the victims to their fate. Danny and Richard were the subduers and restrainers of each victim. Damon, initially restraining, but then put up as a watch-out because he couldn't stop crying. Do you think they are deserving to be found guilty and therefore sentenced to death, regardless of your feelings on the death penalty?
I would have to say yes.
Ow. I hit my head.
Probably.
Probably. Okay. Prosecutor Stephen LaTourette did, and he wanted to ensure Jeff was sentenced to death. Unfortunately, he also knew that in order to ensure Jeff's conviction, he needed an eyewitness testimony, which meant he had to accept the plea deals offered by Rich and Greg's attorneys. This is where you will hate all of this, since you both said yes. Richard provided a videotaped statement as an eyewitness to the murders and pleaded guilty to murder himself. Greg, who hadn't seen the murders firsthand, could still confirm Richard's observations. Greg's diary was also submitted as evidence. Greg pleaded guilty to complicity to murder. Ron, the man who gave 7-year-old Karen a piggyback ride to her execution, gave his confession via video after only 2 hours of interrogation. The only time he ever showed any emotion was when he talked about how much pain the stun gun caused to Dennis Avery.
Not about carrying 7-year-old Karen out to her death.
Nope.
Huh.
Susan Luff's taped confession was equally unemotional. The case against Alice was flimsy, since she wasn't actually present at the farm when the murders took place. But after speaking with Jeff, LaTourette did think Jeff was capable of forming a cult, convinced he was a prophet without the help of... He did not think Jeff was capable of forming a cult and convincing people he was a prophet without the help of Alice. He felt the best course of action to ensure Alice was required to serve some time in prison was to negotiate a deal. However, the judge assigned wasn't having it and demanded that she be held accountable in a public courtroom.
Okay.
I'm all for it.
Yep.
La Tourette made deals with Sharon, Debbie, Dennis, and Tanya Patrick to make sure he had enough for a conviction of Alice. Alice's trial came first. Debbie and Sharon testified against Alice, setting her up as the mother of the cult and Jeff's publicist, pushing his role as prophet. Debbie called Alice out as the one person who could have prevented the murders. Debbie, so could you.
Right. I think anyone could have stood up and said something.
Even if they hadn't tried to stop Jeff, just telling the Averys, hey, you might want to get out of town.
Stay away.
Don't come to dinner. We're going to kill you. So, yeah, I agree. Alice, of course, took the path of the abused spouse, which she was, technically, and claimed she knew nothing of the plan to kill the Averys. Alice had seemingly forgotten her videotaped statement to Van Helst and shown to the jury. When asked by Van Helst, did you know why the Averys were coming to the farm that night? Alice replied, I suspected that it was a sacrifice. You had to be stupid not to know what Jeff was up to. Alice was found guilty on all 15 charges against her. The jury found her guilty of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, meaning she agreed with the others to kill the Averys, and she was guilty of complicity, meaning she actively helped commit the murders. She was sentenced to the maximum prison term possible, a total of 150 years, with eligibility for parole after 115 years of time served. Alice is still alive and serving her term at the Ohio Women's Reformatory in Marysville, Ohio. Jeff's trial was next. They tried for the emotionally abused child excuse that made him feel like he didn't fit in, which led to his being a narcissist. The only question asked by the prosecution, was Jeff insane? To which the answer was no, and he knew he was breaking the law when he killed the Averys. When it came time for closing statements, Jeff decided he wanted to teach a class.
Oh, God.
Which he started by saying, I am the prophet of God. I am even more than that. Much, much more. The jury took less than 2 hours to return a guilty sentence with a recommendation he be put to death. On September 21st, 1990, Jeff was sentenced to die in the electric chair. Judge Parks set the date of April 17th, 1991, exactly 2 years to the day after the murder of the Averys. Damon, insisting he was innocent, rejected a plea deal which would have him serve only 37 years in prison. He was found guilty of aggravated murder and sentenced to 120 years, eligible for parole in 105. He is still alive and serving at Mansfield Correctional Institution, which, Cody, you and I have seen into.
Mm-hmm.
We stood on the catwalks at Mansfield Penitentiary and looked into Mansfield Correctional Institution, and you can see cages, and the men are allowed 1 hour of outside time in those cages a day. Otherwise, it is complete solidarity. Ron Luff pleaded guilty to 5 counts of aggravated murder and kidnapping and was sentenced to 170 years. He is alive and serving at Allen Correctional Institution in Lima, Ohio. Susan Luff, Sharon Blunchley Brand, and Debbie Oliveras all pleaded guilty to 5 counts of conspiracy to murder. They were sentenced to 7 to 25 years and were all paroled in 2011 after serving almost 20 years. Danny Kraft, who still believed Jeff was a prophet at the time of the trial, was sentenced to 50 years to life on 5 counts of aggravated murder and 3 counts of kidnapping. He is still alive and serving at Mansfield Correctional Institution. Richard Brand and Greg Winship pleaded guilty to 5 counts of aggravated murder and were sentenced to 15 years to life. They were paroled in 2010 after serving 19 years. Katherine Johnson was sentenced to 1 year
What?
for obstruction of justice.
That's all they got her on?
Yeah.
Wow. I feel there are no words.
None. Dennis and Tanya Patrick did not serve time in connection with the Avery's death. They were sentenced to 18 months and placed on 1 year probation for obstructing justice. Jeff and Alice continued to talk and write each other from prison, despite him calling her Catherine or Kathy in a letter once. Whoops. At one point, Alice believed Jeff was going to be released within 2 years, and he was going to come rescue her from prison. Their last conversation was on December 17th. Alice apologized for ever having doubted Jeff and asked if she sent him a pair of her panties, if he would be allowed to keep them. Jeff said no, something like that would get me into a lot of shit. Alice's reply, well, we certainly both know what being in shit is like, and they both had a good laugh.
Oh.
After spending 16 years in prison, Jeff exhausted all of his appeals and was executed by lethal injection on October 26, 2006. Good fucking riddance. And this is the conclusion of the Kirtland Blood Atonement killings. I hope you enjoyed the journey. I am so happy to put this out of my tired head. I'm not tired. I am so happy to put this out of my head. Cody, give us a hint about your next episode, and please tell me it is not about child murder.
No child
Yeah,
murder.
can we get like a little bit lighter here?
No child murder. No shit. So, we are going to take a look at one of Ohio's, actually not one of, but the most haunted town in Ohio.
All right. Awesome. So that'll be a little later for everybody. We also have Bobby Mackey's scheduled.
Yes, right after Christmas.
Right after.
It's a good Christmas gift.
So if you guys don't know, Bobby Mackey's, which is one of the most haunted places, I think, maybe in the country,
Yeah.
is scheduled to get torn down. They're doing a renovation, you said?
They're doing a demolition in January, temporarily relocating, and then building a new structure.
Oh, so it's not even going to be on the same ground.
It will be on the same
okay.
ground. Yeah.
Okay.
From what I understand.
Okay. So if you don't know about Bobby Mackey's, look it up. But I have a feeling this will be a good one because I think if we tell spirits, hey, you know this place is going to be knocked down, we should get some pretty good activity. And you get to go with us on this Sunday.
Yay!
And we'll be one of the last groups in there.
Yeah, one of the very last groups.
I think they're having a final like going away party like the middle of January. So
Yeah, it's a super small group of us. It's like, what, 6 people, 7 people?
Don't bring back
7
any
or 8.
souvenirs. No souvenirs.
We won't bring anything back
No.
with us. No. All right. And on that note, I'm done. That's all the weird I can take.
Well, that was weird.
It was weird. I'm so happy to be done with poop. Oh, all right.
thanks for hanging in there.
Yeah, thanks for hanging in there. Own your weird, own your you, and be nice to everybody. Don't cover anybody in poop unless they ask for it. Don't eat poop. That's
Actually,
not
don't even do a
sanitary.
thing.
Don't eat it. That's not sanitary. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Let's go to Chi-Chi's.